today we're going to be watching World War II by Oversimplified. This is part 1, so without further ado, let's get right in there.
It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war. But his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples, just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold.
It's interesting how only a few minutes earlier they said that when Italy colonized Libya, he rioted because he was against imperialism, and only a bit later he, talks about conquering the entire Mediterranean for Italy. So it's interesting how you can switch like that 180 degrees within a few years, probably in his case.
Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, make me prime minister or I'll make me prime minister. And the king said, you and what army? This army. Fair enough. Then he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next.
Il Duce means the leader, which is also the translation of the German word Führer, which is often what Hitler was called. And for some reason they just take that word and use it in English as well, the Führer. So yeah, if you don't know what it actually means, it means the leader. And another word that is often just taken from German into English is the one Third Reich, which in German is Third Reich, or das Dritte Reich, which means the Third Empire, meaning that the Holy Roman Empire was the first German empire, and then the German Empire that existed from 1871 until the end of World War I was the second, and Hitler's was going to be the third one.
Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all of this felt to Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation.
That's the Belgian flag right there.
He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attended a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew and grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some.
By the way, if you want to see a nice movie about that time in Japanese history when they came out of isolationism, you can go watch The Last Samurai, which is an awesome depiction of Japanese culture at the time and the conflict of the old elite against, the part of Japan that wanted to make sure that they wouldn't suffer the same fate as China, that being a, puppet state of European powers.
Went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, hey, cut that out. And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, okay, I guess we'll just go home. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so. Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia. And then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's...
And that's something that we've seen plenty of times throughout history, that country wanted to go to war, and then they somewhat staged an incident that made it look like the other side struck first. I think Germany even did that with Poland in 1939, which obviously no one really believed, but I think they did say something like the Polish army attacked the German border and now they're gonna retaliate, even though it was obviously a German invasion.
Situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler...
I mean, the Allies weren't really a thing at that point. The West didn't really have a favorable opinion of the Soviet Union, so what would become the Allies really doesn't exist at that point yet. But yeah, if you want to see some interesting documentaries about all the different personalities that were in charge at that time, there's a playlist called Evolution of Evil. And they have an episode on Hitler, on Mussolini, on Stalin, and on Hideki Tojo, which was one of the leaders of the Japanese at the time. They also have one on Mao Zedong, but he would only... I mean, he was already doing something. Obviously, he's already involved in the Chinese Civil War, but his reign would only come later. But yeah, they've got a bunch of documentaries, really interesting and really well made. And obviously, if you want to learn a little more about how Hitler came to power and about the Russian Revolution, Oversimplified has a few videos on those. I'm probably going to film a reaction on them at some point.
Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum. Or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But
yeah, that's another German term that is thrown around a lot, Lebensraum, which, yeah, I mean, it's said in this video, it means living space. Yeah, so Hitler did take a gamble a few times before World War before World War II, thinking that the Allies were not ready or not willing to go to war with Germany over something like the remilitarization of the Rhineland. And a few times it, worked out in his favor, and the Allies didn't want to go to war with him. And obviously at some point they were like, okay, if you're going to attack Poland now, we are going to go to war. And it was only Poland that, was somewhat of the final straw for the Allies that made them declare war on Germany. But if they knew, I don't know if they would have, intervened earlier, but I mean, he's gonna get into the appeasement policy and everything when it comes to that, thinking that you could sort of give Hitler what he wants and make sure that, peace remains on the continent. But obviously they didn't know who they were dealing with at the time.
For now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, "I want that thing," and the Allies would say, "You can't have that thing." "Okay, you can have that thing, but no more." "I want that thing." And repeat.
Yeah, so Hitler was, believed at the time that the Allies didn't want to go to war and would only do it in the only if they were pushed to the absolute edge. And he was right in that sort of case that they weren't going to invade Germany just because he increased the army size, and that sort of made the Versailles Treaty not really apply. If you're not gonna be enforcing it, then he was essentially free to do whatever he wanted, and he would do that. And, it would start with Austria and then, everything leading up to the invasion of Poland in 1939.
38, Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudete.
I think Austria actually wanted to join Germany after World War One, after their empire collapsed, and they were forbidden to do so because the Allies obviously didn't want Germany to gain any land. And yeah, now they were, just condemning it, but not really doing anything about it. And that obviously tells Hitler that they're not going to be going to war, or that they're not willing to risk going to war. And he obviously thinks now that he can sort of push them around and make them bend to his will, or, that he can enforce his sort of policies without them getting in the way of them.
Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, "Look, we're going to give you what... Hang on. This meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too? Anyway, we're going to give you what you want." "Really?" "Yeah." "Just like that?" "Yep." "What's the catch?" "Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia." "Okay." Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace. And we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor, and every day on the 30th of September we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action.
I think that's when they realized that Hitler was just going to keep going, and they were not, in fact, going to be able to appease him. And that's when they put their foot down and said, okay, if you're going to invade Poland, it's going to be war with France and Britain. And Hitler, perhaps he was willing to risk it, but he probably still thought that they were bluffing, or that they weren't actually going to go to war against Germany.
He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted...
Yeah, Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, actually defeated the Italians, I think, in 1900, roughly, and stopped an attempt at colonizing the country. Since Abyssinia was given to Italy on paper in the Berlin Conference in 1885, I believe it was, when the European powers divided Africa between them. So they were able to beat them back, but now that Italy had tanks, they were no match. If you want to see some about that, obviously, Evolution of Evil, the episode on Mussolini was, dove a little in there.
To control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge. and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people.
Yeah, that was called the Rape of Nanking. And yeah, they dive a little bit into that in Evolution of Evil's episode on Hideki Tojo. And yeah, I mean, that was something that you could easily compare to anything that the Nazis did in Europe. Japan were, committing some insane atrocities in World War II, especially since they obviously had their samurai code of honor, and that pretty much meant that anyone that would surrender to them in battle would still die, because they didn't accept that, since they had their own policy of not surrendering. They wouldn't accept other countries surrender or other people surrender, and would just execute them for being cowards, essentially.
Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made their relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, "How about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future." Sounds good. This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Yeah,
I think that's still somewhat of a the remaining sort of appeasement policy, thinking that you could still kind of talk Germany out of it, even though they had already taken Poland by that point. So yeah, I think that was probably the reason why Chamberlain had to resign, or resigned in the end. And Churchill was gonna be someone who, went all in on the war against Hitler in that point, or at that time. And yeah, I feel like the Maginot Line, which he said stretched from the French-German border, not extending it all the way to the Channel sounds somewhat naive, because obviously there are no natural borders really between France and Belgium. So if Germany decided to attack France the same way they did in World War I, which is through Belgium, France really couldn't do anything against that at that point, since Germany already had obviously militarized the Rhineland. I believe the reason why they wanted to demilitarize the Rhineland was obviously because that would mean that if Germany wanted to attack France, they had to cross the Rhine first, which would give France time to send enough men either into Germany or, at least to the border to hold them off a little bit, which is also the reason why Napoleon wanted to extend France's borders to the Rhine. And yeah, since they obviously didn't do that, or let Hitler sort of regain military control of the Rhinelands, they were now in a not as good position as they could have been.
France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. so they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your arms fields. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly...
The invasion of Denmark actually took 6 hours in total, I think. So yeah, if you're gonna compare that to the Polish, I think they lost in 2 weeks. France lost in a few months, at least, you know, after the start of their invasion. Obviously, they're already in the war right now, but yeah. So yeah, Germany won a bunch of battles in the beginning due to speed or the Allies not being as ready as they probably should have been, considering that they, you know, sort of saw war coming for a few years at that point, and they weren't really as ready as they could have been in 1939.
After failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the phony war, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium.
It's still somehow a little weird to me that, knowing what happened in World War One, the Allies weren't going to immediately just try to invade Germany. Obviously, he said it before that France still wasn't really as, you know, still was sort of on the technological level that they had been at the end of World War One. It's still kind of weird to me to see how little the Allies actually did between, you know, declaring war on Germany and then Germany's invasion of France. I mean, they really had some time there to invade Germany itself.
But Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too, but they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that.
I think that's one of the major reasons why Hitler thought he was going to be, you know, invincible, and didn't really, you know, explaining all the mistakes that he made in his campaign in the Soviet Union, that he really thought he had kind of an invincibility complex, if you want to call it that, because obviously he was a soldier in World War One, and he saw and lived through the you know, the struggles on the Western Front, which obviously was a complete standstill more or less for 4 years. And now taking France in a few weeks, given the fact that warfare had changed from trenches to tanks and planes, would probably, you know, increase his superiority complex that he had at the time.
Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to secure the Western Front, so he tried to force them into submission. with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attack.
Yeah, so he too was going to try to invade Britain. Obviously, warfare had changed a lot since Napoleon's attempt at doing that. And, Napoleon at the time lost or, was unable to invade Britain due to his naval defeat at the Battle of Trafalgar. In this case, obviously, you not only had the Navy, but the Air Force. So, yeah, we're going to see some, aerial battles. And those were going to become, extremely vital for World War II. Obviously, they had already sort of existed in World War One, but yeah, just like with tanks, planes were going to be one of the most central parts of warfare during this conflict.
At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British Invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside, away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally,
that just shows how Hitler was going to be one of, his own worst enemies, let's just say. And that he really didn't take a rational sort of approach, but more so had a lot of ego in the way that he made decisions. And had they completely destroyed the British Air Force and then launched an invasion, the war would have turned out completely different, since obviously the Western allies, including the United States, would use Britain as their launching pad for their invasion of Europe and against, the Nazis in 1944 at D-Day. So had they, had the Battle of Britain or the Battle for Britain gone a little more different, then, we're talking about a completely different way that this war could have turned out.
The Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
And just like Napoleon, he thought that Britain wasn't going to be a big problem, which is why he would eventually invade the Soviet Union. Without having taken care of Britain yet. And, that was another mistake of his, but he's going to get into that. So, yeah, that was my reaction to the first part of Oversimplified's World War II video. And, yeah, it's a fascinating conflict, obviously. The one that actually brought us the world that we live in today, more or less. Especially, for my home country, which is Germany. So, yeah, all right. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching, and take care.